Imagine this: you're standing in the dimly lit corridors of the Alcazar of Madrid. It's the summer of 1665, and the heat clings to your skin like a second layer. The air is heavy with the scent of burning incense, mingled with something darker, the iron tang of blood-soaked linens. Just beyond the heavy oak doors, the desperate cries of a woman in labor echo through the stone halls. But this is no typical childbirth. This is the result of nearly 2 centuries of intentional royal intermarriage, a cold, calculated march toward genetic catastrophe. Behind those doors is Queen Mariana of Austria. Not only is she King Philip IV of Spain's wife, she is also his niece. That's right, wife and niece. Her husband, the one pacing anxiously outside, is 30 years her senior, and her uncle, inside, her son, Charles II of Spain, is fighting to be born. But what comes into the world that day is so much more than a boy. It is the flesh and blood embodiment of centuries of irresponsible dynastic decisions. A boy who will grow up as the living outcome of royal bloodlines folded back in upon themselves one too many times. Fear can be felt in the palace, not just in the delivery room, but in every whispering corridor. The courtiers move like specters, barely letting their silk slippers touch the ground. They all know, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty is on the verge of extinction. The earlier heirs, Philip Prospero and Maria Theresa, had been too frail to survive. Now all hope is on this birth, a last stand to continue the legacy. But the real horror is not in this one moment. It's buried in the generations of decision that led us here. Every wedding, every deal struck between cousins or uncles and nieces, was a step towards breakdown. This was no chance occurrence. It was a process. The Habsburgs did not blunder into genetic catastrophe by chance. They engineered it as deliberately as a royal procession. Or a funeral. Before we go any deeper into this gruesome chapter of history, I must express how amazing it is that we're sharing it together. Audiences worldwide, brought together by a fascination with the hidden horrors of the past. To understand Charles II, we must begin not with his birth, but with the tangled roots of his family tree. Picture a family so interrelated that it's more like a spider's web than a tree. The path to Charles's troubled start begins with the rise of Habsburg power, and the dynasty's deadly fixation on keeping it all in the family. The Habsburgs began their ascent to dominance in the 13th century. But it was Emperor Maximilian I in the late 1400s who truly reset their genetic course. He followed a straightforward but successful motto: let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. To the Habsburgs, marriage was never about love, or even diplomacy in the usual sense. It was about amassing power and securing it within their own familial bloodlines. The plan worked, at least for a while. The Habsburgs had gained vast territories through their strategically arranged marriages, from Spain to Austria, the Netherlands, and on into Italy. By the time of 1519, Charles V had inherited an empire so vast, it was said the sun never set on it. Beneath that gilded empire, however, the genetic foundation was already decaying. Charles himself was the son of first cousins, Philip I and Joanna of Castile, who shared the same grandparents. When Charles V retired in 1556, he split the empire between his brother Ferdinand, who became the ruler of Austria, and his son Philip II, who became the ruler of Spain. That division would set the stage for generations of intermarriage of the two lines. Philip II, the designer of the dynasty's downfall, married 4 times, often within the family. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his first cousin. After her death in childbirth, he became King of England briefly through his marriage to Mary I. His third wife, a French princess, was a rare exception to family tradition. But his fourth and final marriage sealed the genetic fate of the dynasty. Philip II, now 43, married his 20-year-old niece Anna of Austria. She was both his niece and his first cousin once removed. Their son, Philip III, would carry an already toxic genetic inheritance into the next generation. This is where the science gets unsettling. Inbreeding can be measured. Marriage between first cousins creates children with a 6.25% chance of getting the same harmful recessive genes from both parents. The Habsburgs, however, didn't stop after one generation. They repeated the process again and again. Philip III married Margaret of Austria, his first cousin and sister of his sister-in-law. Their lines were connected from multiple directions, which magnified genetic risks exponentially. Their son, Philip IV, was born with an inbreeding coefficient that would have been eyebrows raised anywhere else. But inside the Habsburg court, it was just business as usual. Philip IV's body began to pay the price. His jutting lower jaw, the infamous Habsburg jaw, made eating and speaking difficult. Though not mentally retarded, his mind was dulled, subtle at first but in later generations progressively worse. The Habsburg jaw mandibular prognathism, to be technical, was a visible threat signal. It's the product of recessive genes, which in most populations are hidden by dominant genes. But in families where cousins marry cousins for centuries, such traits burst to the fore. Portraits of Habsburg rulers illustrate this genetic unraveling. Emperor Maximilian I himself had a slight protrusion. Charles V's deformity was more pronounced. And by the time Charles II came along, well, we'll get to that. As we move deeper into this spectral royal house, the physical price of centuries of intermarriage becomes more evident. In portraits of Philip II, the Habsburg jaw is more pronounced than in the earlier generations. By Philip III's reign, it juts out quite noticeably, an ominous portent of the biological disaster still to come. Philip IV, who ruled Spain from 1621 to 1665, presided over a nation in decline. Spain's golden age was running through its fingers, assailed by war, debt, and diminishing influence. While these were political and economic problems, Philip's own poor health, caused by his polluted bloodline, played a significant role. His speech was slurred and difficult to understand, making it difficult for him to communicate with his ministers and foreign ambassadors. He experienced seizures and was chronically fatigued, crippling him from being capable of leading at critical junctures in Spanish history. But perhaps his most destructive deed was not political, it was personal. In 1649, at the age of 44, Philip IV did the unthinkable and married his 15-year-old niece, Mariana of Austria. She was the daughter of his sister, Maria Anna of Spain, and Emperor Ferdinand III of the Holy Roman Empire of Austria. This made Mariana not only Philip's niece but his first cousin once removed, with multiple overlapping bloodlines between them. This marriage was not a Habsburg family scandal, it was policy. Mariana had first been promised to Philip IV's son, Prince Balthasar Charles. But when the prince suddenly died in 1646, the family merely redirected her to his father. Age and biological risk came second. The prime concern was protecting royal blood and keeping inheritance within the family. Mariana, raised in the austere Austrian court, arrived at the Spanish palace a pale, anxious teenager. Contemporaries commented on her frequent illnesses, her speech difficulties in public, and her deeply melancholic temperament. These symptoms would echo, more loudly and more tragically, in the life of her most renowned son. Philip IV's marriage to Mariana was productive, but almost all of their offspring died in infancy or early childhood. Maria Theresa, the result of Philip's first marriage in 1638, did survive to adulthood but was married off to France's Louis XIV to help secure peace. The long-awaited male heir, Philip Prospero, finally came along in 1657, and the court rejoiced. But not for long. Philip Prospero was frail from the start. After a string of miscarriages and stillbirths, he was born ill and frail. He struggled to walk, spoke with difficulty, and had seizures constantly. Even minor illnesses were life-threatening. Physicians and priests were summoned to his bedside regularly. His immune system was so compromised that even a low-grade fever would find him at death's door. He eventually died in 1661 at the age of 4. With his death, the frail hopes of the Spanish monarchy were once again crushed. And so all eyes once more turned to Mariana, to deliver yet another heir. But the outlook was bleak. The Spanish Empire was falling apart, but the worst threat wasn't merely external. It was within the royal family itself. Any child of Philip IV and Mariana would be genetically burdened beyond anything. Their shared ancestors precipitated an inbreeding coefficient so high, it guaranteed catastrophic risks. physical deformity, mental retardation, and catastrophic health issues. Then Charles came. Queen Mariana began a hard, long labor on November 6, 1665. The birth nearly killed child and mother both. When Charles II was finally born, the doctors in attendance immediately recognized that something was horribly amiss. Even by Habsburg standards, the baby was a surprise. His head was too large, his limbs dainty and weak, and his face wore the unmistakable contours of horrific deformity. The infamous Habsburg jaw, already prominent among his ancestors, had been carried to a ghastly extreme. Charles's lower jaw stuck out so that he could not close his mouth, rendering it nearly impossible for him to masticate or speak intelligibly. But these physical defects were only the beginning. Charles's development of the mind was also lagging from the start. He didn't say his first words until he was 4, and even then, his speech was slurred and muffled due to both his formation of the jaw and delays in thinking. He could not walk without assistance until he was 8. His coordination of the body and motor skills were always poor throughout his life. The court physicians of the 17th century, without any knowledge of genetics, were baffled. Without knowing anything about hereditary disease, they resorted to superstition. Some believed Charles was cursed. Others blamed his mother's diet during pregnancy. The most popular theory, that God was punishing the Spanish royal family for its sins. And yet the reality, while less melodramatic, was more ghastly. Charles II was the inevitable result of nearly 200 years of unyielding inbreeding. Recent genetic studies place the inbreeding coefficient of Charles at 0.254, completely outside the genetic similarity seen in sibling parents' children. In fact, he was more inbred, than his father and mother would have been if they were brother and sister. This had left Charles with identical duplicates of harmful recessive genes at an appalling rate. His body and brain were burdened by a dynasty that had sacrificed biological well-being for political triumph. And Charles II, the final Spanish Habsburg, would be both the living proof and the ultimate cautionary tale of what can occur when family is given precedence over humanity. All the defective genes, all the genetic mutations inherited through generations of inbreeding, all the biological blunders perpetuated through dynasty after dynasty, landed on one man, Charles II of Spain. His body was a blueprint of genetic devastation. What would be known today as several disorders, mandibular prognathism, profound mental incapacity, epilepsy, and metabolic disease, were all agonizingly evident. Still, the Spanish court struggled valiantly to maintain the fiction of a healthy king. His deformities were camouflaged by posed portraits. Public sightings were staged with meticulous care. Even official visitors were instructed informally about what to do and not do, so as not to disclose the reality. But reality always comes out. Across European courts, gossip turned to alarm. Descriptions portrayed Charles II incapable of ordinary conversation, drooling and prone to seizures, and whose actions were more childish or worse, bestial, than those of a king. Some claimed he was gibbering, slumped on his throne, grunting in place of speech. Imagine the psychological torment. A king born to huge power, but locked in a body and brain that betrayed him. Surrounded by nervous courtiers, Charles became deeply paranoid. He fantasized about poisoners roaming palace corridors and assassins lurking in the shadows. To protect himself, he instituted fanatical food-tasting rituals and would not eat unless meals met bizarre personal specifications. Even soft foods like porridge and broth were difficult to eat due to his jaw abnormalities. He remained dangerously underweight, his body too weakened to obtain proper nourishment. But his personal tragedy was not his own. It was an empire in crisis. The king needed an heir to ensure the Spanish throne was secure. But it was becoming clear that Charles was even uncertain what marriage was, much less whether he could perform one physically. At 14, in 1679, Charles II was married to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a beautiful and sturdy French princess, and cousin of Louis XIV. The wedding was a seal on an alliance with France. It was a merciless mismatch from the start. Marie-Louise was pale and terrified on the wedding day, while Charles was barely out of it. He was hardly able to stand, had to be supported continually, and was largely unresponsive. The union was left unconsummated for months, perhaps years, due to the severe physical and mental disability of Charles. In clandestine letters to her family, Marie-Louise wrote of a horrible destiny. Marriage to a man who drooled continuously, was unable to speak sensibly, and possessed no concept of husband or king. Worst of all, she increasingly realized what the Spanish court feared most: Charles would never father children. The 10-year marriage ended tragically. Marie-Louise suddenly died at the age of 26 in 1689. Foul play was suspected by many because of the political atmosphere surrounding the Spanish succession. However, contemporary historians think she died of the crushing emotional and physical strain of her impossible marriage. Anxious to produce an heir, Charles II wed again the following year. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was a German princess chosen as part of an alliance-European marriage. But like the first, this marriage was barren. Also from her own letters, Maria Anna provides an even darker portrait of the king. She complained of his growing paranoia, compulsive behavior, and rages when routines were disrupted. He would gaze at his own image for hours, as if under a spell. He became obsessed with exorcisms, believing that he was under a curse, spending money freely on religious rituals in an attempt to break a supposed spell. His faith in Catholicism, already strong at the Spanish court, turned fanatical. Charles would pray before relics for hours, begging for a miracle that never occurred. By his 30s, Charles seemed to be decades older. His hairline receded to strands of gray. His skin whitened and sickly. Any infection, any cold, any cut was a threat to his life. His fragile body, starved of strength and attacked by disease, slowly withered away. Meanwhile, the Spanish Empire continued to crumble. Without strong leadership, provincial governors lost control. The economy weakened. Trade routes shifted. The empire's wealth, once drawn from vast colonies, now dwindled. And all the while, rival nations waited like wolves at the gates. The crisis looming on the horizon, Charles II was childless. Upon his death, the Spanish Habsburg line would be extinct, and a bloody struggle for who should occupy Europe's most powerful throne. The War of the Spanish Succession loomed, with foreign powers vying to seize the opportunity created by the vacuum of power Charles's death would leave behind. And Charles knew they did. Despite his disabilities, he understood the weight of his legacy. He was the last of the Habsburgs of Spain, the last, fractured branch of a tree once whose shadow stretched across a continent. His reign was not one of power or domination, but of weakness, and the cost of centuries of human arrogance disguising itself as royal tradition. Although his intellectual abilities were modest, Charles II understood one dreadful reality. He was the last of his dynasty. The burden of an empire rested on his frail shoulders, and he knew that his death would spark war throughout Europe. He only suffered more psychological torment from this awareness, and he was burdened with something he could never finish. His royal court became a surreal theater of debasement. Ceremonies continued as if everything was normal, choreographed with pomp and precision around a king who could barely sit up. Foreign ambassadors filed reports of unsettling scenes. Charles II salivating over his food at formal dinners, sitting blankly in front of the guests while music is played, and producing incoherent sounds at official events. The Spanish nobility, obedient but realistic, discreetly created a system operating on behalf of the king, rather than through him. The advisors and counselors effectively governed, with Charles reduced to the role of a ceremonial high king, a physical symbol of monarchical power, exhausted by disease and inbreeding. Religion, so integral to Spanish life in the first place, became the court's soul itself. Masses, prayers, and rituals daily filled the royal chapel as courtiers prayed daily to God for help. Charles himself reached out for relics and rituals, hoping that religion would cure what medicine never could. The world, however, was observing. Each of the great European powers had spies and diplomats based in Madrid, regularly reporting back to their rulers on the king's health. They all realized that his days were numbered, and that he would die without an heir. France, ruled by Louis XIV, was certain that it had the strongest right to the Spanish throne. but the Austrian Habsburgs claimed the throne should be returned to their house. Alliances built and fell apart as they waited for the inevitable. The War of the Spanish Succession. Underlying this impending crisis, however, was a greater tragedy, the human price of royal inbreeding. Charles II's body was a walking testament to centuries of genetic degradation. He endured constant pain, isolation, and the overwhelming knowledge that he could never measure up to what was hoped for. Testimonies of those who knew him intimately show he got pleasure out of small things. He liked to watch performances at court and seemed to take comfort in rituals like prayers and meals. He stroked his pets and even smiled occasionally in close quarters. But even eating, the most fundamental act of comfort, was an excruciating process. He had a difficult relationship with his mother, Queen Mariana. She had searched desperately for remedies in his childhood, calling in doctors, priests, and even folk healers. As he aged, she became his shield and his goad, protecting him from disagreeable realities while still urging him to fulfill royal duties. The strain upon her was emotional. Her own health deteriorated under the constant anxiety of raising an sickly, unfit heir. Letters reveal a woman torn between maternal affection and political despair. To Spaniards, all of this was secret. Well-choreographed ceremonies and bulletins preserved the illusion of a functioning monarchy. Charles was only seen in public briefly and in highly choreographed situations, where his disabilities could be concealed or rationalized. But rumors swirled. Folktales emerged. Some whispered that he was cursed, others that he'd been altered at birth or bewitched by witches. Economically, Spain was collapsing. Corruption was unchecked without a strong monarch to discipline it. Trade policy was disordered, colonial government relaxed, and governors grew bold with the knowledge that they'd never be punished. Even the mighty Spanish army, which had been invincible across Europe, was in disarray, repeatedly defeated, unable to cope with the better-led French, Dutch, and English armies. Ironically, religious institutions thrived. Charles's spiritual obsessions meant more money for churches, more power for monasteries, and new energy for the Spanish Inquisition. The royal court became increasingly mystical, looking for supernatural explanations for the king's state. Culturally, this grim era left its mark. Art from the time took on eerie, almost nightmarish qualities. Portraits plagued by horror, insanity, and divine vengeance. Authors tackled subjects of decay, madness, and punishment, reflecting a kingdom ruled by a shadow of a man. As Charles reached the age of 30, his decline accelerated. His seizures intensified, sometimes lasting for hours, with him staying unconscious for days at a time. His speech was all but incomprehensible. He needed constant help with the most essential tasks: eating, dressing, even walking. The King of Spain had become a living relic, a pitiful, shattered reminder of a fading empire. As each year went by, the question of who was to succeed Charles II grew more urgent and more dangerous. Foreign powers grew bolder, making their claims to the Spanish throne with increasing aggression. War was not just probable, it was inevitable, and at the center of it all was a dying king, uncomfortably aware that his condition could spark a war across the continent. Despite his mental limitations, Charles II was cognizant of his importance. The fate of Europe quite literally hung in the balance on his shoulders. The pressure, unbearable on even the healthiest of minds, added new levels of concern to his already fragile state of mind. In his later years, Charles withdrew almost entirely from public life. His world shrank to the dark, quiet rooms of the royal palace, where there were just a few loyal servants remaining. These loyal servants learned to interpret his gestures and grunts, translating them into action. Routine was his only comfort. Strict daily rituals gave a shaky sense of control over the mental chaos. Physically, Charles's looks had also deteriorated to a frightening degree. His once youthful body was now emaciated, the skin a lifeless gray, and his receding white hair made him look like an old man when he was still in his 30s. The infamous Habsburg jaw had become so pronounced that it distorted his entire face. Eating was a perilous activity. He could only eat liquids or the softest of foods, and even then he usually choked. Mealtimes needed to be supervised constantly. Each mouthful was a gamble. His mental state continued in the same downward trend. Charles became intensely paranoid, believing that there were enemies within the palace walls who were attempting to poison him or steal his throne. He would not eat anything that was not prepared by a trusted servant, and he would frantically search his food for any evidence of tampering. Even his marriage to Maria Anna, which had for a little while offered a hope, began to break down. She had entered the marriage with pity and patience, hoping that devotion and love could overcome the king's handicaps. But reality was crueler. As Charles deteriorated, Maria Anna withdrew. She abandoned life at court, spending most of her days locked away in her private apartments, removing herself emotionally and physically from the pitiable figure of her husband. Meanwhile, the court went on, as if the empire hadn't already fallen in all but name. Ceremonies were still performed. Edicts were still promulgated. Diplomats still came and went. But everyone knew the truth. Charles was king no longer in any practical sense. Power had shifted to ministers, advisors, and foreign diplomats who exploited the king's weakness for their own ends. Across Europe, the tension mounted. Every cough, every convulsion, every whispered report of Charles's failing health was communicated to royal courts from Paris to Vienna. Military leaders quietly mobilized their forces. They all knew that when Charles died, the War of the Spanish Succession would erupt. Yet the tragedy of Charles II was not merely political, it was biological. His torment was the ultimate consequence of 2 centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. This formerly great dynasty had imploded under the weight of its own fixation on genetic purity. Charles was not merely a man, he was a warning. And that warning did not go unheeded. Even during his lifetime, other European royal houses began to rethink their own marriage policy. Although medical science had yet to understand genetics, the connection between family intermarriage and appalling health issues had become impossible to ignore. Court physicians, still lacking scientific jargon, advised discreetly against unions between close relatives. It was a gradual process, and one resisted by tradition-minded aristocrats, but the Habsburg disaster had planted a seed of doubt in royal Europe. In the meantime, in Spain, the populace bore the brunt of their monarch's disability. Economic recession became worse. Colonial revenues declined, trade collapsed, and inflation soared. Social unrest simmered as a powerless government could not listen to its people's cries. The mighty Spanish Empire, which had conquered lands, controlled the destiny of nations, and directed the course of history, was now a shadow, an empire in name only. Racked by his inability to produce an heir, Charles was obsessed with finding a miracle. He summoned doctors, priests, and even folk healers, begging for some sort of cure that could grant him the one thing he could never have: a son to bear the Habsburg name. Religion, once a mainstay of Spanish life, became an overwhelming presence in Charles's final days. He prayed for hours a day, prostrate before relics and saints. His chambers resembled a chapel. Crucifixes, rosaries, holy bones, candles everywhere. Priests attended him at all times, offering spiritual guidance, comforting his tortured mind, and listening to his increasingly desperate mumblings. Charles's mental state deteriorated with frightening rapidity. He was beset by crushing depression, fixation fears, and hallucinations. Some days, he wouldn't leave his rooms, convinced that assassins waited in the corridors. Other days, he would become hysterical, demanding to be taken to holy sites within the palace in search of divine intervention. His body, as well, was irretrievably breaking down. He looked almost 80 in his late 30s. He could barely stand without support. Previously feared throughout Europe, the Spanish army had become a shadow of its former strength. Officers were serving a king who could hardly speak, much less give orders. Morale disintegrated, and soldiers deserted by the hundreds, unsure if they were fighting for a country or a legacy already decaying. The once sacred monarchy lost its hold on the Spanish imagination. The regional leaders asserted their independence, and local nobles began questioning their loyalty to a throne that no longer enjoyed confidence. Ironically, as royal power waned, the church became stronger. The The Spanish Inquisition explained the king's condition as divine punishment for the nation's sins, and clergy began assuming an increasingly active role in state affairs. Art and literature reproduced the chaos. Painters documented hallucinatory, ghostly scenes that portrayed a court ruled by a man more myth than monarch. Writers drew motifs of corruption, insanity, and God's vengeance, thinly veiled allegories for a kingdom crumbling under Charles II. Even Charles realized the horrific symbolism of his life. In spite of his intellectual deficiency, he knew he was a living symbol of dynastic failure. Tormented by this, he grew isolated and tortured. He plunged into ever more wacky religious rituals. Days were spent praying mutely, fasting on food and water in the hopes that piety would cure him. He even came to believe his suffering was God's test, and that through devotion, maybe a miracle would follow. Mariana of Austria, his mother and longtime guardian, saw in horror. She had spent years attempting every conceivable cure, medical, religious, or superstitious. But as her son approached death, she finally lost the hope. There would be no salvation. Her own health broke down under the weight of her son's agony and the fall of the empire. All over Europe, foreign nations gave up hope that Charles would ever produce an heir. Diplomats and generals began making contingency plans for the inevitable dissolution of the Spanish Empire. Treaties were drafted, armies mobilized, alliances shifted in preparation for a war that everyone knew was coming. Within Spain, belief in the monarchy crumbled. The dissonance between the glories of times past and now the degenerate man on the throne was too vexing to be forgotten. Witty jokes and satirical hints were exchanged by the commoners, clever enough to avoid the Inquisition, yet painful in nature. Foreign merchants withdrew. Credit vanished. Trade started to shift to alternative rival empires. Spain, the wealthiest nation in the world, now staggered toward bankruptcy. It was also bad militarily. French armies moved in along the Pyrenees. English and Dutch fleets raided Spanish shipping lanes. Spanish armies lost battle after battle as their tired, leaderless armies dissolved. As the king's health declined, his sense of doom grew greater. He understood, or at least thought he understood, that his death would trigger a war that would remake Europe, and this made his psychological pain more extreme. His physical condition was no better. He could hardly eat. His weight plummeted. His immune system collapsed. Diseases that would have been insignificant in a healthy man became deadly. Speech, which had been nearly impossible to understand, dwindled almost to zero. He employed facial expressions and gestures, though even those were shortchanged by his disabilities. Few were left capable of comprehending him. Loneliness swamped him. Seizures gained speed. Sometimes he'd have several in a single day, remaining unconscious for hours. After each, he would regain consciousness confused, disoriented, and occasionally unable to recall where, and even who, he was. As his physical body gained no strength, neither did his grip on reality. Charles became increasingly paranoid. He thought people were trying to poison him. He would sit at dinner, examining his food obsessively, and trust only a few devoted servants. His marriage to his wife, Maria Anna, had fallen apart. The woman who had once been espied to give Spain an heir shunned the court entirely. Their union, intended to establish a dynasty, had become a sad whisper of disappointment and emotional wasteland. The Spanish court held up the fiction of monarchical power, but it was well understood by all, especially foreign ambassadors, that Spain was leaderless. Their dispatches painted a picture of a court in disarray, ruled in theory by a king going mad. As Charles II visibly declined, the rest of Europe accelerated its war plans. The actual question now was no longer whether the Spanish Empire would shatter, but how the spoils of war would be divided among the conquistadors. In Spain itself, central power continued to dissolve. Regional governors defected from Madrid, and nobles concentrated on protecting their own interests in the upcoming tempest. The very idea of a unified Spain began to vanish. Charles's final months were months of bodily pain as much as virtual absolute loneliness. He left his chambers rarely, and when he did, his appearance shocked everyone who saw him. Thin, feeble, and distorted, His presence did only too well to confirm the whispers about his condition. He could hardly eat. Liquid foods or soft foods only were feasible, and even these caused choking with his jaw deformity. Each meal needed to be supervised lest he choke. Seizures overwhelmed him more than ever. They were more frequent and prolonged. Witnesses were appalled at the horrific contortions his body underwent during these fits. His face, already misshapen, became virtually unrecognizable. Mentally, he drifted further away from reality. He no longer recognized familiar people. He spoke to dead relatives. He reacted to ghostly apparitions that appeared only to him. The line between dreams and reality faded. Foreign diplomats observed anxiously, knowing his passing would ignite the largest European war in years. Generals readied troops. Kings and ministers braced for a shock. Charles II of Spain passed away on November 1, 1700, at the tender age of 34. His body, ravaged by a lifetime of inherited spots, gave up at last. The physicians who had struggled for years to understand his disease marked his passing with a feeling of relief and fear. In his dying moment, the king lay alone, neglected by the world, abandoned even by his wife. His dying words were gibberish, a pitiful cry of a lifetime spent talking without voice, talking in disorder. Even death could not hide the Habsburg jaw, an unsightly hump that testified to the decline of the dynasty. With his passing, the Spanish Habsburg line was brought to an end forever. No heir, no tomorrow. An empire that had controlled much of the known world was left adrift, and it led to the War of the Spanish Succession, which would rage for over a decade and claim hundreds of thousands of lives. Charles's autopsy revealed the horrific price of inbreeding. His internal organs were deformed and decomposed. His brain was underdeveloped. His digestive system was deformed. His reproductive system was so underdeveloped that he likely never had the physical capacity to be a father. The news was greeted in Spain in a mixture of sorrow and relief. The dynasty might be over, but so too was Charles's torment, and with it maybe the dark page of a formerly great empire's slow collapse. In Europe, the response was immediate and brutal. Armies marched. Treaties were torn asunder. A continental war broke out, a war born in one man's body. But aside from the war, Charles II left a legacy that stretched further than any battlefield. A cautionary tale of the pursuit of bloodline purity. Other royal families, horrified by the collapse of the Habsburgs, began questioning centuries of incestuous marriage. Slowly, sometimes begrudgingly, the tradition began to fade. Charles II was a symbol as much of political rot as of what happens when human ambition tries to overcome biology. A queen had once borne a son in hopes of saving a dynasty. But she created something else, a fleshly embodiment of royal arrogance, a warning in flesh. In the dark halls of Madrid's Alcazar Palace, where the wails of a newly born prince had once echoed, silence finally reigned. The experiment failed. The monster they feared was never malevolent, it was unavoidable. And in his deathbed, the Habsburg period came to a bloody, sad conclusion.